Most criminals run from danger, but once, just once, America faced a man who ran toward it. He boarded a plane in bright clothes, blending into the noise of a normal travel day. No threat, no warning. Just an ordinary passenger with an extraordinary plan. Hours later, he would be standing alone in the rear cabin of a Boeing 727. The passengers released, the money secured, the parachute strapped tight, forcing a commercial airliner to fly low, slow and silent over the Utah desert. And then he jumped into freezing wind, into total darkness, into a landscape he knew better than anyone searching for him. But the human mind leaves fingerprints long before the hands do. A typed letter with habits buried inside the keystrokes, a magazine touched once, a parachute abandoned where no parachute should be, a stranger buying a milkshake at midnight with stiff, painful steps. Piece by piece, the picture formed. Not a ghost, not a myth, but a man molded by training, shaped by skill, and undone by the tiny details he believed were invisible. This is the story of how a flawless plan unraveled, of the hijacker who thought he could rewrite gravity, and the investigation that proved no one truly disappears. The Boeing 727 held steady against the night air. As it pushed westward, over the interior of the United States, its engines producing a constant mechanical pressure that filled the darkened cabin. The aircraft had left San Francisco only minutes earlier, now configured for an unusual and restricted flight path. Ordered by the lone man who had seized control hours before. Behind the sealed cockpit, the main cabin had been stripped of passengers, cleared at his insistence after the ransom delivery. Only a few remaining crew members were positioned forward of the locked flight deck, complying with his instructions and avoiding any sudden movement. They remained in a tight space defined by dim lighting, thin air, and the overriding awareness that the man behind them had orchestrated each moment since the hijacking began. He stood alone in the rear of the cabin, methodically preparing the equipment he had ordered and the items he had brought with him earlier in the day. His actions followed a sequence built on practiced familiarity. He had already instructed the crew to depressurize the cabin, requiring the pilots to maintain altitude at 16,000 feet and speed at 200 miles per hour. These numbers were not arbitrary. They matched the operational window of the Boeing 727's aft stair configuration and the safe limits of a jump carried out under controlled conditions. With the cabin thin and cold, he secured the straps of his jumpsuit, adjusting them twice with deliberate movements. The helmet came next, fitted smoothly, followed by the parachute that he tightened across his chest and back. Each buckle was tested in quick motions, his hands tracing familiar hardware designed for military jumps and weekend skydiving runs. The air inside the cabin had become noticeably sharper after depressurization. Loose papers and small items had been swept away earlier to prevent interference. He opened the container, holding the ransom, the 2 flight bags, whose weight and contents had been confirmed only minutes before by the crew. The bundled currency was packed tightly in rows, stacked with precision, and sealed for rapid handling. He repositioned the bags toward the rear stairway, checking their weight distribution against the gear he wore. There was no hesitation. He had trained for this moment over years in controlled environments far different from the confined interior of the aircraft. But the rhythm of his preparation displayed the confidence of someone long accustomed to moving between air and ground. The cockpit lights remained minimal. The pilots, following his demands, maintained radio silence, except for required operational acknowledgments. No pursuit aircraft appeared on radar. The hijacker had warned that any sign of interference would trigger consequences, and the flight crew, understanding the gravity of the situation, adapted fully to his conditions. The aircraft cut through the dark sky, while he studied the terrain below through a small cabin window, noting the faint silhouettes of Utah's mountain edges and the patchwork of faintly lit communities. He had selected the region carefully, narrowing the zone according to altitude, speed, and trajectory. The communities he had listed earlier to the crew, small but identifiable points across the Utah landscape, served as markers confirming position. With each passing minute, the aircraft moved closer to the corridor he had calculated would provide the safest and most controlled descent. He moved toward the aft section of the plane, where the rear staircase was located. The cabin lights flickered in minimal settings, but the darkness worked to his advantage. He needed no bright illumination. The flight crew stayed forward, aware of the boundary they could not cross. He carried no expression that reflected uncertainty or wavering intent. His movements were steady, guided by muscle memory and an understanding of aircraft mechanics, earned both in civilian life and during his military service overseas. The hum of the engines remained unbroken, a constant pressure behind every motion he made. When he reached the rear, he positioned himself near the stair controls, placing one foot slightly forward to brace against the expected airflow. Outside, the Utah desert and foothills spread into the night, largely hidden, except for occasional reflections of isolated house lights, distant roadways, and faint grid patterns. From this altitude, the land appeared almost static, but he had studied the region long enough to recognize the approximate drop zones from memory alone. He checked the altimeter strapped to his suit, confirming the reading against the aircraft's maintained altitude. Everything matched the plan. In the forward cabin, one stewardess waited tensely, aware that his behavior indicated an imminent jump. She had observed his preparations earlier, tracked the progressive steps of the sequence, and understood his skill level from the precise manner in which he handled the equipment. She had served on countless flights, dealt with emergencies and disruptions, but nothing mirrored the controlled method she had witnessed during the last stretch of hours. She avoided sudden movement, kept her hands visible, and focused entirely on staying within his stated parameters. Any deviation could risk the lives of the remaining crew and herself. The aircraft continued along the planned course. The pilot's instruments displayed their movement toward the final checkpoint town he had listed, a small community marking the edge of his intended corridor. Each mile brought them closer to the moment where he would act without warning, or second attempt. 2 states earlier, he had already removed his flashy clothing, switching into the jumpsuit, and reducing any extra weight or loose items. The pistols and grenade that had initiated the takeover earlier in the day were now irrelevant. Their function had been fulfilled long before the San Francisco landing. What remained was execution of escape, and he managed the preparations with the clinical precision of someone who had rehearsed the timing repeatedly. The aircraft's rear section shifted slightly within the turbulence of nighttime winds. He leaned into the motion, unaffected, retrieving the final strap, securing one of the bags. When he glanced again through the window at the darkness passing below, the terrain had begun to align with the markers he had memorized. The cockpit instruments likely confirmed the same reality for the pilots ahead. The stewardess, watching from a distance, saw him step closer to the stair controls. She remained motionless, except for the involuntary tightening of her posture. The sense of anticipation had grown to its peak. He lowered the rear staircase. The mechanical structure extended downward, and the sound of rushing air surged into the cabin, tearing across the interior with immediate force. Papers, fabrics, and any unsecured material were driven forward, though most of the area had been cleared earlier. The loadmaster position, that would normally monitor such a procedure, was absent, leaving only the hijacker's own assessment to gauge the airflow patterns. The cold air pressured his suit, flattening fabric against his body. There was no pause as he stepped toward the threshold. The stewardess moved just enough to confirm that the money bags had shifted to his side, secured in a manner that compensated for the wind. She noted the silhouette of his helmet as he leaned outward briefly, assessing the drop. The noise became nearly overwhelming, a full-throttle roar that drowned out all other sound. The aircraft was now positioned over the stretch he had chosen hours before. When the moment aligned with his calculations, he stepped out of the aircraft and disappeared instantly into the night below. The sudden absence of movement in the rear cabin created an abrupt contrast to the chaos that had filled it. The stairway remained open for a few seconds longer before the pilots raised it back into position. The stewardess, breathing sharply, moved forward to inform the cockpit crew of what had occurred, her steps unsteady but determined. The pilots, still under the restrictions he had imposed, maintained vigilance and headed toward the designated landing point. The threat of an explosive device no longer remained, though they could not be certain until the aircraft reached the ground. Hours earlier, long before the jump, the chain of events had begun quietly on the ground in Denver. The man had boarded the aircraft without any suspicious behavior noted by agents or crew. His entrance blended with the pattern of travelers moving through the airport. The brightly colored clothing he wore attracted casual attention, though it carried no meaningful significance at the time. He took his seat near the rear, carrying luggage that passed inspection and met standard protocol. The flight toward San Francisco by way of Los Angeles seemed routine, with passengers settling into the typical rhythm of long-range travel. Only after the Denver departure did his actions disrupt the expected order. The off-duty pilot, who first approached him, saw the hand grenade, and then the pistol, confirming the threat that initiated a sequence of rapid crisis procedures. Once the envelope labeled with instructions was handed to the crew, the path of the flight shifted from its commercial purpose to a controlled hostage-based trajectory, with strict compliance to his rules. The airline's response teams, trained for hijacking scenarios emerging in that era, concentrated on passenger safety above all else. Their decision to meet every demand stemmed from the broader climate of skyjackings in the early 1970s, where lives were prioritized through negotiation and controlled submission. The San Francisco landing unfolded under a heightened state of caution. The aircraft was guided to a remote section of the airport, following the precise runway and ground conditions he specified. Personnel were limited to those he permitted, with vehicles positioned according to his requirements. The delivery of 4 parachutes and the $500,000 in cash was executed methodically. The crew complied with his directives regarding the return of all written and typed materials, ensuring no traceable documents remained on the aircraft. Once the passengers were released and the crew minimized, The next phase began with the aircraft lifting into the night and heading toward Utah. The Federal Bureau of Investigation monitored developments through dispatch updates, but had no means to intervene directly. The hijackers' warning regarding pursuit aircraft restricted the agency's options until the plane resumed safe landing procedures after the crew was released. The priority remained minimizing risk. The FBI prepared contingencies based on likely outcomes, anticipating a jump in a region suitable for parachuting, but without exact coordinates or certainty. Identifying his landing zone would depend on post-event evidence and ground reports. On the ground below the flight path, the Utah landscape remained quiet. Communities of varying size settled into routine nightly patterns. Lights in neighborhoods flickering across the valley floors. Small road networks guiding occasional late-night vehicles. No one in the region knew that a hijacker had selected their terrain as the stage for his escape. The air above them carried no sign of disruption, other than the faint echo of an aircraft maintaining unusual speed and altitude parameters. When he exited the aircraft, the vast expanse of land absorbed him without any visible trace. The parachute deployed somewhere within the dark fields and foothills outside Provo, hidden entirely from the view of anyone who might have been awake. The descent, conducted under low visibility, required precise landing instinct and the ability to gauge ground distance through minimal lighting. He managed the transition swiftly, landing with injuries that he controlled well enough to continue moving toward the nearest roadway or landmark suitable for recovery. Hours later, the small hamburger stand employee, who saw him around 11:30 p.m., had no explanation for the sudden appearance of a man wearing heavy clothing and carrying himself with rigid posture. The purchase he made and the interaction that followed were routine behaviors observed countless times by workers across the region. The teenager who drove him a short distance had no context for what had happened earlier that evening in the air above the state. To them, he was simply another stranger moving through the night. By the time the aircraft landed at its destination and the crew provided full debriefs, the hijacker had already integrated himself back into familiar surroundings. The money, parachute equipment, and related gear were stored in a manner he believed would withstand initial scrutiny. He operated under the assumption that his planning and execution would protect him from immediate suspicion. But even as he settled into the hours following the jump, the first threads of the investigation had already begun moving toward him. Evidence gathered from the aircraft, from the recovered parachute near Provo, from witness observations, and from the knowledge shared by acquaintances who recalled his earlier discussions about hijacking plans, would soon converge. Each detail formed a strand of a larger structure that would ultimately trace the extraordinary crime back to its architect, unraveling the elaborate sequence he believed would grant him anonymity. The aircraft had completed its journey. The sky above Utah had emptied. The night absorbed the moment without commotion. But the investigation that would expose the identity behind the jump had already started, building momentum from the very instant he vanished into the darkness below the Boeing 727. The morning of April 7, 1972, moved across the eastern airports at its usual pace, marked by rolling suitcases, boarding announcements, and passengers preparing for the long westbound flights that would carry them toward California. United Airlines Flight 855 was scheduled to travel from Newark to Los Angeles, with a refueling stop in Denver. Nothing about its manifest or assigned crew signaled anything unusual. The airline operated dozens of similar flights each week, and the list of names attached to this one blended seamlessly into the normal passenger register. Pilots moved through their flight checks, attendants reviewed the required safety routines, and the boarding area filled with travelers carrying coats, business folders, and the small details of ordinary journeys. Among those passengers was a man whose manner did not stand out in any overt way. He wore clothes that would later be described as flashy, but in an airport filled with varied styles and personalities, his appearance carried no immediate significance. The clothing was bright enough to attract brief notice, yet not enough to alert security or staff. He walked with steady posture, shoulders square, and carried luggage that passed through screening without comment. As with countless travelers, in the early 1970s, security systems were limited in comparison to later decades. Hijackings, though present in the era, were not yet deterred by the layers of screening that would eventually become standard practice. Bags were checked manually, but not with the degree of precision that would later define aviation security. Small firearms or improvised threats could be concealed with relative ease, and the man had planned for that reality well in advance. When he boarded the aircraft, he moved toward a seat located near the rear of the cabin. This section offered proximity to the area he would eventually use for the jump, though no one on board recognized any strategic purpose behind his placement. Passengers settled around him, adjusting seatbelts, folding coats, and preparing for the long flight ahead. The man kept his behavior controlled, avoiding unnecessary interaction. His face carried no visible tension, and his posture remained relaxed. He placed his bag near his seat and directed his attention toward the small rituals of preparation that accompany commercial flights, checking personal items, organizing belongings, and observing the flow of people entering the cabin. The flight departed Newark without incident. During the initial hours, the cabin environment reflected the calm rhythm of long-distance commercial travel. Stewardesses moved down the aisle, offering beverages, engaging with passengers, and performing routine checks. The pilots monitored the aircraft's performance from the cockpit, focusing on altitude, speed, and the route toward Denver. Weather conditions across the central United States remained stable. Nothing in the atmosphere or the aircraft's operation suggested the dramatic disruption that would later define the journey. During this stretch, the man maintained a quiet presence. Observers later recalled that he behaved no differently from those around him, occasionally adjusting his position, opening a magazine, and glancing around the cabin. One detail would eventually stand out in hindsight: his extended visit to the lavatory after the Denver stop. But at the time, it raised no alarms. It blended into the normal sequence of passenger behavior. The crew treated him as they treated everyone else, unaware that he carried a grenade and a pistol concealed within his belongings. The weapons remained hidden until the moment he chose to reveal them. When the aircraft reached Denver, the stop unfolded with routine efficiency. Passengers disembarked, new ones boarded, and the cabin crew prepared for the next leg of the flight. The man did not draw attention to himself. His luggage remained undisturbed, and he handled his belongings with calm precision. The Denver airport, busy with flights moving through the Rocky Mountain corridor, offered no hint that one of the most meticulously executed hijackings of the decade was about to unfold. The aircraft taxied back into position and accelerated along the runway, lifting once again into the western air toward Los Angeles before the planned San Francisco diversion ordered hours later. Shortly after takeoff from Denver, the rhythm of the flight shifted. The man's posture straightened, and his movements became deliberate. Passengers seated nearby might have noticed his focus, but no one could interpret it as preparation for what followed. He reached into his belongings and retrieved the grenade first. Its appearance changed the environment instantly. Fear, confusion, and the abrupt shift from routine to crisis unfolded in seconds. The presence of the pistol reinforced the threat. Any possibility of misunderstanding disappeared. The off-duty pilot seated nearby reacted instinctively, stepping toward the man before stopping abruptly. When confronted with the second weapon, the hijacker maintained a controlled position, ensuring that his movements conveyed the seriousness of the situation. The crew's internal communication structure activated with immediate urgency. Flight attendants relayed the threat forward, while the man prepared the sealed envelope he had brought with him. The document labeled with the words that confirmed the purpose behind his actions. The envelope contained the typed hijack instructions that would define the next several hours of the flight. The pilots received the envelope and began reviewing its contents. The instructions were precise, written in direct language that left little room for negotiation or improvisation. They included the demand for $500,000 in cash, the requirement for 4 parachutes, the order to land at San Francisco International Airport using a specific runway, and the demand for strict control over personnel, vehicles, and procedures on the ground. The document outlined the expected behavior of the crew and the conditions under which passengers would be released. It also demanded the return of all written or typed materials exchanged during the event. The tone of the instructions revealed the writer's familiarity with aviation protocol and the mechanics of hijack response. In the cabin, the passengers remained unaware of the full scope of the threat. They observed the tension among the crew and the sudden shift in their behavior, but few understood the complete situation until later. As the aircraft continued toward its unintended destination, the crew followed the hijacker's instructions precisely, maintaining calm and attempting to minimize panic. Their training emphasized compliance and the preservation of life, and they executed those principles while adapting to the unfolding event. The man stayed near his seat, weapons visible enough to maintain control, but handled in a measured way. He did not behave erratically or without purpose. Each movement suggested preparation for the later stages of his plan, though no one else recognized the pattern at the time. The stewardesses monitored his posture and expressions, observing that he remained focused rather than unpredictable. His eventual shift into the lavatory for an extended period deepened the mystery, but it still did not reveal the full scope of his intentions. When he emerged appearing subtly altered, possibly wearing a wig and mustache that had not been present earlier, the change raised questions, but not enough to shift the crew's immediate priorities. As the aircraft approached San Francisco, the hijacker's instructions dictated every aspect of the landing. The captain's initial consideration of using Grand Junction was overridden by the details in the typed document. The decision to cooperate fully stemmed from the established policy to preserve passenger lives. The airline's ground teams prepared the required cash and located the parachutes, ensuring that each component matched the specifications provided. Vehicles and personnel were positioned according to the hijackers' restrictions, preventing any approach that could trigger a violent response. The landing itself unfolded with tension held firmly in control. After the aircraft touched down on the designated runway, the restricted movement around it emphasized the gravity of the situation. The delivery team followed every detail, approaching slowly, placing the money and parachutes where instructed, and stepping back without sudden actions. The hijacker monitored the scene carefully. When satisfied with the positions of the cash and equipment, he signaled for the passengers to be released. One stewardess also left the aircraft, while the remaining crew members moved toward the cockpit under his command. With the passengers gone and the cabin nearly empty, the environment changed noticeably. Silence replaced the earlier murmur of voices. The hijacker retrieved the money bags and parachutes, ensuring that everything was accounted for. He then issued the next set of instructions regarding altitude, speed, and cabin configuration. The flight crew adhered to each requirement, preparing the aircraft to lift off once more into the darkening sky. The night had taken hold. By the time Flight 855 departed San Francisco, the hijacker had transitioned fully into the final stage of his plan. Each detail of the next phase had been refined long before this moment, guided by his experience as a helicopter pilot and skydiver. The cabin pressure reduction, the speed limit, the altitude, and the navigation over specific Utah communities were not improvisations. They were calculated components of an escape method that mirrored the earlier D.B. Cooper hijacking, while integrating personal expertise and new adjustments. In the dim cabin, he prepared his equipment with meticulous movement. The jumpsuit replaced the earlier clothing, and he tightened the straps with both hands, checking friction and alignment. The helmet came next, fitted smoothly and secured at the chin. He lifted the parachute and slipped into its harness, locking the buckles and testing each connection. He positioned the money bags with careful attention to weight distribution. His familiarity with freefall procedures showed in each step, revealing a background rooted in practiced descent training. Outside the aircraft, the landscape beneath them remained largely invisible. The cockpit instruments displayed the markers that would guide the final approach to the hijacker's chosen region. The crew understood that he would leave the aircraft somewhere near Utah, though they could not determine the exact location. The stewardess who monitored him from a distance recognized the shift in his posture. As he moved toward the rear aircraft door, she braced herself for the moment she knew was coming. He lowered the rear stairway. The rush of wind forced itself into the cabin with overwhelming force, changing the air pressure and dominating every sound. He stepped toward the threshold, leaning outward to gauge the conditions below. His feet adjusted automatically to the movement of the plane. When he determined the exact moment, he stepped into the darkness and vanished beneath the aircraft. The cabin grew still in the absence of his presence. The stewardess moved forward to inform the cockpit, and the pilots prepared for landing procedures that no longer required compliance with his demands. The hijacker, descending into the Utah night, began the final stage of his escape. Hours later, he would reappear at a small hamburger stand in Provo, walking normally despite the impact injuries sustained during landing. To the employees, he appeared as a man passing through late at night, and nothing in his demeanor suggested that he had just executed one of the most complex hijack operations of the decade. What no one yet knew was that the first discovery linked to his descent, the parachute pack, found near a culvert by a 14-year-old boy, would trigger the investigative chain that began unraveling his identity long before he realized how quickly the evidence would lead federal agents to his doorstep. The typed envelope, resting in the hands of the flight crew, only moments after the Denver departure, represented the precise beginning of the controlled sequence that would define the remainder of the hijacking. Its arrival in the cockpit marked the shift from routine commercial flight to a crisis governed by rigid terms. Everything inside the envelope had been prepared in advance. The demands, the required landing instructions, the behavior expected of ground personnel, and the operational conditions necessary for the hijacker's later escape. The instructions were not handwritten improvisations. They were structured, typed and planned with an understanding of airline protocol. Once read, they left no ambiguity about the seriousness of the situation or the level of preparation behind it. The captain and first officer reviewed the list, aligning their immediate decisions with the detailed requirements. The hijacker's demand for $500,000 in cash placed significant pressure on the airline, but not outside the realm of precedent for skyjacking cases of the era. Hijackings between 1968 and 1972 had created a pattern of incidents where crews were trained to prioritize compliance to preserve lives. The threat of weapons intensified the urgency. The instructions also dictated the need for 4 parachutes, specifying a mix of front and back rigs, which suggested an intention to use the equipment rather than employ parachutes solely as leverage to prevent sabotage. The specificity indicated knowledge of parachuting equipment and procedures. The requirement to land the aircraft at San Francisco International Airport on runway 19 left was unusual in its precision. The hijacker knew the airport layout, or had studied it enough to identify a runway that allowed physical separation from regular operations and greater control over ground access. The pilots considered whether alternative airports might offer a safer or more strategic setting. But the instructions eliminated those possibilities. Every detail reinforced that deviation could escalate the threat. The crew's decision to proceed towards San Francisco was immediate and necessary. In the main cabin, the hijacker maintained his controlled posture. The crew continued standard interactions around him, but moved with far more caution. He kept the grenade visible enough to demonstrate its presence as an immediate danger, without handling it in a way that increased instability. The pistol remained secured in his grip or positioned in a way that allowed him to maintain control without displaying tension. The flight attendants monitored his movements, adjusting their responses to maintain calm among passengers who still did not fully understand the situation. As the aircraft advanced towards San Francisco, communication between the cockpit and ground control followed established emergency protocols. The Federal Aviation Administration relayed the hijacker's demands to United Airlines crisis personnel, who began the process of obtaining the ransom. They coordinated with law enforcement, but recognized that immediate tactical intervention was not viable. The man's threat involving pursuit aircraft prevented any attempt to intercept or tail the flight. This condition mirrored earlier hijacking events, demonstrating that the hijacker understood the limitations of federal response under his specific parameters. Any misstep could force a catastrophic outcome inside the aircraft. During this period, the hijacker remained near the rear of the plane, occasionally checking his belongings or adjusting his position. At one point, he entered the lavatory for an extended period. His stay was long enough to draw notice from the flight attendants, though none dared to question his absence directly. When he emerged, subtle changes in his appearance suggested he had used the privacy to alter his facial presentation, likely applying a wig and mustache. This served no purpose inside the aircraft, but would become relevant after he left it. The crew registered the change but remained focused on maintaining compliance. The San Francisco ground teams mobilized quickly. Ransom money was sourced from local banks and prepared in bundles to meet the demand. The cash was loaded into 2 flight bags to ensure manageable weight and ease of transport. The parachutes were gathered from skydiving supply locations and aviation emergency stores, representing a mix of civilian and military-style rigs. Each was inspected for functionality. The tension at the airport built steadily as personnel were briefed on their roles. The hijacker's instructions delivered strict rules governing the approach of ground vehicles and the conduct of personnel. No sudden movements, no boarding attempts, and no unnecessary communication were permitted. As Flight 855 descended toward San Francisco, the cabin atmosphere thickened with pressure and silence. Passengers observed the change in the flight crew's demeanor and the unusual landing preparations, but still had limited comprehension of the scale of the crisis. The hijacker remained calm, occasionally adjusting his clothing or repositioning items in his seat area. The grenades and pistol ensured the crew followed all instructions without deviation. The pilots communicated with ground control only when necessary, omitting any additional information that might provoke risk. The wheels touched down on runway 19 left. The aircraft slowed under the soft blur of runway lights and taxied to a remote position designated by the hijacker. The surrounding tarmac had been cleared. All unnecessary personnel were removed. Only the required delivery team approached the aircraft, moving slowly and cautiously to place the money and parachutes in the exact location he had specified. The weight of the crisis could be felt in the stark emptiness of the surrounding runway. The hijacker watched from the cabin, maintaining full control. The door opened briefly to receive the ransom and equipment. The flight crew followed every directive, retrieving the items with measured precision. Once inside, the hijacker examined the cash quickly. The stacks were consistent with the expected amount. He checked the parachutes to ensure they matched usable configurations. With the money secured and equipment confirmed, he directed the crew to release all passengers. Their evacuation proceeded in organized fashion. One flight attendant also left the aircraft under his instructions. The cabin, once filled with voices and movement, emptied into a space defined only by the presence of the hijacker and the remaining crew. The aircraft underwent a rapid transition. The hijacker ordered the next phase of the operation, requiring the plane to take off immediately. The pilots prepared without hesitation. They initiated the sequence to lift the aircraft back into the sky, following the altitude and speed constraints he demanded: 16,000 feet, 200 miles per hour. These conditions created the environment necessary for the Boeing 727's distinctive rear stairway to be deployed during flight, a feature that formed the centerpiece of his escape strategy. As the aircraft climbed, the hijacker moved to the rear and began preparing his equipment thoroughly. The cabin lights were dimmed, leaving only enough illumination for him to see the straps and fittings he adjusted. He fastened the jumpsuit with deliberate movements, securing each buckle and tightening each strap. He placed the helmet over his head, ensuring the fit was stable and the chin fastened. The parachute harness came next, checked with the attention of someone familiar with aviation descent equipment. The money bags were heavy, but he tested them against his center of gravity, adjusting their placement to maintain control during freefall. The depressurization followed. The air became noticeably thin, forcing the crew to breathe with controlled steadying. Loose objects were removed earlier, to prevent them from being sucked toward the rear. The hijacker confirmed the cabin's configuration before stepping toward the stairway. The remaining crew watched from a distance as he approached the controls. The stairway, once lowered, would flood the cabin with wind and noise. Below them, Utah's night landscape stretched outward in quiet isolation. Small communities, farms, roadways, and darkened fields formed the terrain that would receive him. The town markers he had listed earlier were checked in the cockpit against the navigation instruments. Each one passed beneath them in sequence. The hijacker pressed his gloved hand lightly against the window, observing the darkness and aligning it with his mental map. The moment he lowered the staircase, the aircraft was overtaken by violent airflow. The sound surged through the cabin, drowning out everything else. The stewardess who had remained on board braced herself against the nearest structure. The pilots continued to hold the aircraft steady, despite the sudden turbulence. The hijacker moved into position, adjusted his load one final time, and leaned outward into the darkness. He stepped off without hesitation. The crew could not see him fall. They could only feel the pressure shift as the weight left the aircraft. The stairway remained open until the pilots retracted it, after regaining stability. Once the staircase closed, the cabin grew still again, though the faint chill of depressurized air still lingered. The stewardess moved forward to inform the cockpit that he had gone. The pilots resumed normal cabin pressure controls and began preparing for descent procedures that marked the end of their direct involvement. The hijacker was now somewhere descending through the darkness of the Utah sky. His path would carry him into fields or foothills within the region he had identified in earlier planning. He would land with the money secured and equipment intact, though the terrain would dictate the force of impact. The injuries he sustained during landing would be manageable, allowing him to remain mobile. Hours later, the ground evidence would begin to surface. A 14-year-old boy named Peter Fanning, out with his family near Provo, found a parachute pack near a culvert. His father notified the sheriff's office. Investigators quickly realized the object belonged to the hijacker. This early discovery became the first fixed point in a widening search. The FBI began parsing through aircraft evidence: seat belts, wrappers, cigarette butts, a forgotten note, and a copy of Mainliner magazine. Everything was sent to the FBI laboratory. Fingerprint analysis, handwriting comparison, and material inspection would soon begin constructing a profile. Witness reports from the hamburger stand and the teenager who offered a ride added context to the hours following the jump. The anonymous call from a Provo acquaintance, who mentioned knowing someone who had once outlined a foolproof hijack plan, provided the first direct lead toward identifying the man behind the operation. That lead would unravel everything. Within 48 hours, federal agents would arrive at the home of Richard Floyd McCoy Jr., recovering almost the entire ransom, the typewriter used to create the typed hijack note, and the skydiving equipment that completed the connection. The hijacker who stepped into the Utah night would soon face a rapid reversal of fate, as the controlled precision of his crime gave way to the speed of a federal investigation. Closing around him, San Francisco International Airport prepared itself for an operation that diverged sharply from the routine structure of commercial aviation. Long before Flight 855 descended onto runway 19 left, airport officials, federal agents, airline managers, and local law enforcement had already formed an improvised but coordinated response network built around the typed instructions delivered by the hijacker. The demands were exact, leaving little room for interpretation. Vehicle positioning, personnel movement, and delivery procedures had to match the instructions precisely, and every deviation carried the risk of escalating the crisis. The airport's normal rhythm, aircraft taxiing, passengers moving through terminals, and maintenance equipment shifting across service roads, disappeared around the remote area designated for the landing. As the aircraft approached the airport, the operations team directed other flights away from the landing zone, opening a wide buffer around the runway. Lights along the designated path were adjusted to avoid distractions or unnecessary activity. Personnel not involved in the delivery were cleared from the vicinity entirely. Only a select group, briefed explicitly on their narrow roles, remained ready to approach the aircraft after landing. Their movements were rehearsed quickly and under pressure, guided by supervisors who reminded them that the hijacker had specified strict limits for ground interaction. On the other side of the airport, the ransom money was being finalized. Local banks had supplied the currency in bundles, prepared for rapid transfer, stacked in a way that balanced weight distribution inside the flight bags. United Airlines staff, working under the oversight of law enforcement, verified the total amount and secured it for delivery. The 4 parachutes had been gathered from various sources, including local skydiving clubs and emergency aviation stores. Their condition was checked, but the variety of rigs reflected the urgency of the situation. They included 2 back-mounted parachutes and 2 reserve chest rigs. These were placed beside the cache, forming the full package that would be handed off to the hijacker the moment the aircraft reached its final position. In the cockpit of Flight 855, the pilots monitored their descent with heightened concentration. Every routine element, altitude, airspeed, flap adjustments, and instrumentation checks, carried elevated significance under the crisis conditions. The cabin behind them remained controlled, silent, and stripped of its earlier civilian noise. The hijacker stayed in place near the rear, maintaining vigilance, while adjusting minor details of his equipment. The cabin crew, confined to their limited area, and aware of the weapons still in his possession, avoided any movement that might provoke reaction. Their actions remained measured and deliberate, each person focused solely on compliance. The aircraft descended smoothly into the Bay Area airspace. The city lights spread outward beneath them, in a network of illuminated grids and arterial roads. But the crew retained focus on the runway coordinates, dictated by the hijacker. The landing gear deployed, and the plane crossed the threshold of runway 19 left. The touchdown was controlled and decisive, the kind of landing executed under extreme tension, yet guided by professional experience. As soon as the wheels met the ground, the aircraft decelerated into the isolated area, prepared for the exchange. When the aircraft came to a full stop, the ground operations team initiated its movements with precision. A small number of personnel drove the delivery vehicle toward the aircraft, stopping exactly where the hijacker's instructions required. No one approached beyond the permitted boundary. The vehicle carried the 2 bags of cash and the parachutes, which were lifted with cautious, steady motion and placed on the tarmac. The team then retreated, giving the flight crew space to retrieve the items without risk of proximity-driven panic. Inside the cabin, the hijacker observed every movement. When he was satisfied that the delivery matched his requirements, he allowed the crew to retrieve the bags from the doorway. The money was brought inside first, placed near his designated area. The parachutes followed, each lifted carefully and passed into the cabin without incident. The flight crew avoided direct eye contact with him, focusing solely on the mechanical actions needed to transfer the items. Once all materials were inside, the crew closed the doorway and sent visual confirmation to the cockpit. With the exchange complete, the next phase of the operation began. The hijacker ordered the release of all passengers, who were led off the aircraft in a coordinated sequence. They exited quickly, guided by ground personnel, who directed them away from the scene. The passengers moved with a mixture of confusion, fear and relief, some realizing only now the full extent of what had unfolded during the flight. A single stewardess also left the aircraft, stepping into the open air with visible tension. The remaining flight attendants, under orders from the hijacker, moved forward toward the cockpit and closed themselves into the forward section. The cabin, now emptied of civilians, transformed entirely. The hijacker shifted from threat management to operational preparation. The presence of the money, parachutes, and his personal equipment created a new environment, a controlled workspace, where each item had a defined purpose in his escape strategy. He checked the weight of the bags again, lifting them slightly to gauge balance and potential movement during freefall. He examined each parachute briefly, verifying straps, ripcords, and harnesses. Though he had limited time, his actions suggested familiarity with equipment, rather than casual inspection. Up front, the pilots received the next set of commands from him. They prepared the aircraft for departure, adjusting flaps, running through takeoff procedures, and notifying ground control of their upcoming liftoff. Under emergency protocols, the runway remained cleared. Moments later, the engines increased in power, and Flight 855 accelerated once more into the night sky, climbing steadily away from San Francisco. The departure marked the beginning of the controlled transition toward Utah. The altitude rose to 16,000 feet, and the airspeed settled at 200 miles per hour, exactly as the hijacker required. The cabin pressure was reduced, a task executed carefully by the pilots to avoid sudden discomfort, but still achieve the level necessary for the disorienting frigid environment that he wanted. The temperature inside the aircraft dropped noticeably. Breath formed faint condensation under the dim lights. The hijacker moved to the rear, focusing on the gear he would soon rely upon for his escape. The cockpit contained the tense concentration of individuals, aware that every mile brought them closer to the moment the hijacker would leave the aircraft. The pilots monitored the navigation route, adjusting the heading according to the sequence of towns listed in the typed instructions. Each town represented a checkpoint. He had selected them for their visibility from altitude, even at night, forming a loose chain guiding the aircraft toward an approximate drop zone. In the now empty cabin, the space felt stretched and hollow. Every sound carried more sharply: engine vibrations, intermittent mechanical shifts, and the faint rustle of fabric as the hijacker prepared. He removed the bright clothing he had worn earlier, in favor of the jumpsuit packed inside his luggage. The suit, lightweight but durable, allowed flexibility for movement, and prevented unnecessary drag during descent. He tightened the straps systematically, pausing only to ensure friction points and buckles aligned correctly. The parachute harness required additional care. He slipped his arms and shoulders into the main harness, pulling the straps across his chest and stomach before fastening the metal locks. He tugged the straps once, with force to verify firmness. His helmet came next, secured at the chin and checked twice for stability. He tested the fit by rotating his head slightly in both directions. He then inspected the goggles, ensuring they would rest securely in place once he stepped into the wind. The money bags were placed beside him. He studied their size and shape, calculating how they would affect body position in freefall. The weight was substantial, more than 25 pounds in total, and storing it incorrectly could destabilize him during descent. He looped the bags together, using improvised straps, tightening the connection so that both would move as a single unit. He positioned them at his front, adjusting the strap tension to distribute the load evenly. The hijacker stepped closer to the threshold. He leaned outward, letting the wind strike him directly. The airflow tested the integrity of his equipment and the balance of the money bags. He adjusted his footing and shifted his weight slightly backward to counter the pull of the wind. His hands moved with practiced composure, confirming the positions of each strap and attachment. He steadied himself once more. The aircraft passed the final town listed in his instructions. The cockpit likely recognized this as the last marker before the jump, though no communication occurred beyond the operational necessities. The aircraft maintained altitude and speed. The rear remained open. The hijacker moved forward once, testing the momentum of his body against the wind. Then he shifted his weight outward and stepped into the darkness below. The motion was immediate and irreversible. He vanished beneath the aircraft as the noise swallowed the cabin. The crew could not track his descent. They only recognized his departure through the sudden shift in air pressure and the absence of movement near the rear. The pilots waited several seconds, then initiated the procedure to retract the stairs. Once the staircase locked back into place, the cabin felt briefly still, though the unnerved silence carried the weight of what had just occurred. The remainder of the flight proceeded without his influence. The crew followed standard descent procedures and prepared to land once they reached the designated airport. Their focus shifted from compliance to recovery, though the psychological imprint of the crisis would stay with them long after touchdown. Below, the hijacker fell through the Utah night. His parachute deployed somewhere over the Provo region. He struck ground with significant force, sustaining injuries but retaining the ability to move. His descent ended in a landscape he knew well, a mixture of open fields, drainage areas, and secondary roads familiar enough for him to navigate quickly toward populated areas. His arrival at the Provo hamburger stand hours later seemed ordinary to those who witnessed it. His posture was stiff from impact stress, but his behavior appeared consistent with someone passing through late at night. No one could have known that he had exited a Boeing 727 only hours earlier, carrying nearly $500,000. San Francisco airport personnel, law enforcement, and the airline's crisis teams remained unaware of his exact fate for the moment. Their next focus was the investigative infrastructure that would mobilize the instant evidence began surfacing. The hijacker had executed the jump with calculated precision, but the investigation that would soon unravel his identity had already entered motion the moment he stepped off the aircraft. The departure from San Francisco marked the beginning of the most delicate phase of the hijacking, where the flight, stripped of passengers, carrying a reduced crew, and holding the ransom and parachutes, moved into its final operational configuration. The atmosphere inside the aircraft had transformed from the earlier tension of hostage management to a cold, calculated sequence focused entirely on enabling the hijacker's escape. The release of passengers had removed the largest variable, leaving only the flight attendants and cockpit crew responsible for carrying out the remaining instructions with absolute precision. Their controlled movements reflected a shift from fear-driven compliance to the mechanical determination required by their roles. Every action became part of an irreversible progression toward the moment when the man at the rear would exit the aircraft into the darkness below. After takeoff, the aircraft climbed into the night sky with a steady, unbroken ascent. The San Francisco lights receded behind them, replaced by the open blackness of high-altitude flight. The cockpit crew guided the aircraft upward, monitoring instruments with increased vigilance. The altitude settled at 16,000 feet, and the airspeed stabilized at 200 miles per hour. These numbers, defined by the hijacker long before the moment arrived, matched the operational envelope required for the Boeing 727's unique rear stairway mechanism. The aircraft's design, including the ability to lower its rear stairs in flight, a feature meant for ground loading, had become the core of the hijacking plan. The hijacker understood this engineering detail, exploiting it with the precision of someone who combined aviation knowledge with skydiving expertise. Inside the main cabin, the hijacker moved with controlled purpose. The removal of passengers had created an atmosphere of stark emptiness that amplified every sound. His preparation became the central movement within that space. The first stage involved reorganizing the interior to eliminate any potential hazards. Items that could interfere with airflow or become dangerous projectiles were removed or secured. As the cabin pressure dropped, the air grew thin and cold, and the interior lighting dimmed to a low, functional level that left only silhouettes and shadows. The few remaining crew members kept their distance, staying near the forward bulkhead and maintaining direct observance without physically encroaching on the rear section of the aircraft. The hijacker handled his equipment with practiced order. The flight bags containing the ransom were examined again, their contents checked by touch rather than sight. The stacks of currency were tightly bundled, separated into organized blocks that made them manageable even under the force of wind. During the jump, he tested the balance by shifting the bags slightly and assessing their pull on his body. He began fastening them into a harness-like arrangement that allowed him to secure the weight to his front without risking uncontrolled movement. His attention then shifted to the parachutes. The two back-mounted rigs were stacked near his feet before he selected the one he intended to use. He examined the pack by running his hands along its edges, confirming that the cords and seams were intact. The reserve chest parachutes were evaluated next, though he did not need both. His handling of the equipment reflected familiarity, a level of comfort that stemmed from his experience as a skydiver and military-trained flyer. Nothing in his actions showed indecision. Each piece of equipment was part of a sequence he had practiced, at least mentally, long before stepping onto the aircraft in Newark. He removed the bright clothing he had worn earlier, though unusual at the time of boarding. It had served a purpose in misleading potential witnesses. Now, he shifted into the functional, subdued jumpsuit that had been packed in his luggage. The fabric flexed easily and conformed to his movements. He tightened the straps along his legs, closing each buckle with a firm click. When he lifted the main parachute and fitted the harness across his torso, the alignment was exact. He adjusted the shoulder straps by pulling them downward sharply and checking the friction to ensure they would not slip during the jump. The helmet followed. He lifted it with both hands, lowered it over his head, and secured the chin strap tightly. He tested the stability of the helmet by rotating his head and applying slight pressure. The goggles remained raised for the moment, ready to be pulled down seconds before the jump. The hijacker moved with the posture of someone who had executed countless jumps, even if none under conditions remotely close to this level of risk. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, the pilots monitored the navigation route. The hijacker's instructions had listed towns across Utah, each one serving as a visible checkpoint that allowed him to track the aircraft's progress without relying on cockpit instruments. The pilots followed these points precisely, adjusting the heading for each marker. As the aircraft transitioned over Nevada and approached Utah, visibility from the cockpit revealed scattered lights across the landscape, indicating the proximity of populated areas. The pilots remained silent, except for essential communication with air traffic control. Their attention remained divided between maintaining stable flight and acknowledging the reality that the hijacker's final action was imminent. The stewardess who remained on board stayed positioned where she could monitor the rear cabin without approaching it. She had witnessed the shift in his demeanor as he prepared his equipment, noting each step in the sequence. Although she maintained distance, she could see the progression toward the final moment. The secure fastening of straps, the adjustment of weight distribution, the lowering of goggles, and the movement toward the stair controls. Her breathing remained controlled, but her posture held the rigid tension of someone absorbing the gravity of an unprecedented event. The cabin around her was cold from the depressurized air. She felt the temperature settling into her skin, a sharp reminder of altitude and the unnatural conditions inside a commercial aircraft. She kept her hands visible to avoid sudden movements that might disrupt the hijacker's concentration. Her focus remained fixed on observing him, while ensuring compliance with every instruction he had provided. He approached the stairway. The Boeing 727's rear stair controls were located on the right side, allowing him to access them without needing to cross the cabin. He paused only to glance out the small window, observing the nighttime terrain, the faint glow of towns, the dark stretches of open land, and the uneven patterns of the Utah landscape formed a vague but recognizable outline. He checked the altimeter again, confirming that the aircraft still maintained the altitude necessary for a controlled jump. The airspeed, felt through the tremors in the cabin, matched the requirements for stable descent once he stepped off the aircraft. He engaged the mechanism to lower the stairway. The shift was immediate and dramatic. The rear of the cabin erupted with deafening wind, a force that consumed the space and overwhelmed every other sensory detail. Documents, loose fabrics, and lightweight debris moved violently toward the opening. though most items had already been cleared. The stewardess shielded her face briefly from the sudden change in pressure. She adjusted her grip on the nearest solid surface to maintain her balance. The wind tore through the cabin with relentless intensity, flattening clothing and reducing visibility to a blur of movement. The temperature dropped even more sharply. The hijacker stood at the top of the stairs, with the posture of someone entirely at ease, with the chaos around him. His feet braced against the metal surface. The wind pushed against him, tugging at his equipment. He lowered his goggles and secured them over his eyes. The money bags were positioned in front of him, held tightly by the straps he had fashioned earlier. He leaned outward slightly to assess the airflow and the distance between the aircraft and the ground. Though the darkness concealed most of the landscape, he relied on the faint luminosity of scattered lights and the consistency of his mental map. He shifted his weight onto his forward foot, preparing for the transition from the aircraft to the open air. His hand gripped the side of the stairway, holding long enough to stabilize his balance against the force of the wind. His posture tightened. The crew, watching from a distance, recognized the split-second sequence that preceded a parachute jump. The lean, the tension in the legs, and the subtle shift in center of gravity. He stepped into the darkness. The disappearance was instant. One moment he was framed in the rear opening of the aircraft, and the next, he was gone, pulled into the night with the force of gravity accelerating him downward. The stewardess felt the sudden absence more than she saw it. The wind continued to tear through the cabin until the pilots retracted the stairs. When the mechanism closed, the interior regained relative stability. The noise diminished, but did not disappear. The temperature remained low. The cabin lights flickered faintly as the interior adjusted to normal pressure levels. She moved forward immediately, heading toward the cockpit to report that the jump had occurred. Her steps were unsteady from the residual turbulence. The pilots received the information with silent acknowledgement, refraining from any sudden reaction that might disrupt aircraft stability. They shifted their focus toward the final descent procedures that would bring the aircraft safely back to the ground. Below the aircraft, the Yusefta fell through open air at a speed that left little margin for error. The parachute deployed at the height he intended, though the exact details of his descent remained unknown to those on board. The force of the landing would leave him injured but mobile, his practiced handling preventing more severe consequences. He would make his way toward Provo, navigating through fields and rural roads until he reached areas where he could blend into late-night civilian activity. While he moved toward temporary concealment, the investigation had already begun taking shape above him. The aircraft landed safely. The crew provided immediate statements. Every detail they remembered, his clothing, his behavior, his equipment, his instructions, formed the earliest frame of the case. The FBI began organizing agents across Utah, California, and nearby states. The search for physical evidence would begin within hours. The parachute found by a 14-year-old boy near a culvert would become the first tangible link in the chain of clues leading federal agents to identify the hijacker. The controlled descent from the aircraft had marked the end of the airborne phase of the crime. But on the ground, the investigation that would unravel everything had only just begun. The hours following the hijacker's jump marked the transition from an airborne crisis to a sprawling, multi-state ground investigation that needed to begin before the trail cooled. The moment the Boeing 727 touched down safely after its final flight segment, the surviving crew members were escorted away from the aircraft and directed into structured debriefing procedures. Their observations, actions, and recollections would become the first authoritative record of an event carried out with meticulous planning and executed under conditions few had experienced. Law enforcement recognized that every minute mattered. The hijacker had a head start, and the darkness of the Utah night had concealed both the descent and the landing. Recovering even one piece of evidence could determine the speed and direction of the initial search effort. The FBI's Salt Lake City field office received the first confirmed details as the crew provided their sequential accounts. The precise altitude and speed at the time of the jump helped define the possible landing radius. The aircraft's navigational records, checked against the list of Utah towns the hijacker had required be flown over, enabled investigators to calculate a corridor stretched across a broad but traceable segment of the state. It was clear the jump had occurred somewhere in or near Utah County, but the exact point remained unknown. Federal agents began establishing a perimeter, working with local law enforcement to identify areas where a parachutist could have landed safely in the prevailing wind patterns and terrain. The terrain across central Utah consisted of fields, foothills, irrigation channels, patches of rural development, and open land. At night, these features created obstacles, even for experienced skydivers. The weather conditions had been cold, but there were no storms and no major winds, which meant the hijacker could have controlled his descent with relative precision. The investigative teams recognized that a man with military parachute experience, combined with civilian skydiving knowledge, could land with surprising accuracy even under limited visibility. This reality widened the investigative challenge. He could have chosen almost any field, pasture, or access road across dozens of square miles. While agents began mapping terrain, another critical component emerged at nearly the same time. On the morning after the hijacking, a 14-year-old boy from Provo, out with his family near a drainage culvert, made the discovery that would become the first physical breakthrough. He spotted a parachute pack lying near the culvert's edge, partially covered by grass and dirt. The boy carried it to his father, who, after realizing the object was unusual and potentially linked to the news of the hijacking, contacted the local sheriff's office. Deputies arrived quickly, securing the area and notifying federal authorities. The location of the pack provided the first firm geographic reference point and confirmed the broader assumption that the hijacker had landed within proximity of Provo. FBI agents reached the site and began documenting the position of the parachute. It was one of the 4 parachutes supplied in San Francisco. The pack bore no obvious signs of tampering or damage beyond those consistent with ground impact. Investigators photographed the surroundings, noting the soil disruptions and small indentations that might correlate with a landing pattern. The proximity to accessible roadway networks highlighted the possibility that the hijacker had reached a populated area shortly after landing. Agents expanded the search radius around the find, looking for footprints, fabric remnants, strap fragments, or any trace of the ransom money. They found none, which indicated he had maintained control of his equipment and moved quickly away from the landing point. While the evidence was processed, the main investigative focus shifted toward establishing the hijacker's movements after he touched the ground. Witness canvassing began across Provo and surrounding communities. Agents visited late-night diners, convenience stores, gas stations, and roadside businesses to determine whether anyone had seen a man arriving with unusual clothing, injuries, or behavior. The canvassing required a broad net, extending across the timeline between the hijacking and the following morning. Most locations reported no unusual visitors, but 2 accounts emerged that would soon prove significant. One came from an employee at a Provo hamburger stand. He recounted that around 11:30 p.m. on the night of the hijacking, a man matching the general clothing description had entered the establishment and ordered a milkshake. The employee noticed that the man appeared stiff, possibly from injury, but behaved in a calm, controlled manner. The detail of the late-night visit aligned with the presumed landing window. The second account came from a teenager who told investigators that he had offered a ride to a man that same night in exchange for $5, a significant amount for a stranger to pay for a short ride. The descriptions provided by these witnesses were consistent, indicating that the hijacker had reached Provo shortly after descent and had been mobile enough to interact with others without drawing immediate suspicion. The investigative structure deepened. Agents cross-referenced the witness descriptions with aviation records, skydiving registries, and local military personnel rosters. They considered the characteristics essential for performing such a jump: skydiving experience, military familiarity with parachutes, physical conditioning, and knowledge of Utah's terrain. They also factored in behavioral elements witnessed on the flight. The hijacker had displayed a calm, methodical manner. He had handled equipment with competence, and he had crafted typed instructions with technical precision. As this analytical process unfolded, a crucial lead arrived through a telephone call. A local Provo resident contacted the FBI with information about a man he knew, someone who had once discussed a hypothetical hijacking plan, described as foolproof. The caller did not know whether this was connected to the actual hijacking, but the timing and content of the recollection prompted agents to act immediately. The man referenced was Richard Floyd McCoy Jr., a 29-year-old Vietnam veteran, helicopter pilot, and skydiver who lived in Provo. His background matched multiple elements associated with the crime. His training as a military helicopter pilot meant he possessed advanced aviation knowledge. His skydiving experience meant he understood descent mechanics. His presence in Provo placed him within the region of the jump site. Agents began conducting background research. McCoy's military service file revealed certifications in advanced parachute operations. His skydiving experience included numerous jumps. His enrollment as a police science student at Brigham Young University suggested familiarity with law enforcement procedures. Financial difficulties reported by acquaintances matched the possible motive for an operation targeting large-scale ransom. These overlapping factors elevated him immediately to a top investigative lead. Meanwhile, evidence from the aircraft arrived at the FBI laboratory for analysis. The hijacker had left behind a handwritten note found in the cabin. Laboratory handwriting examiners secured samples from McCoy's military records and compared them against the note. The comparison yielded striking similarities, and the analysis concluded that McCoy had written the note. This discovery established foundational evidence linking him to the crime. The investigation intensified. A fingerprint examiner reviewing items recovered from the aircraft, wrappers, seat components, and printed items, identified a latent print on a copy of Mainliner magazine left by the hijacker. When compared to McCoy's fingerprint file from his military service, the match was exact. This single piece of forensic evidence provided direct physical confirmation that the hijacker and McCoy were the same individual. As these findings converged, agents reconstructed McCoy's timeline during the hours following the hijacking. They identified his presence in Provo shortly after the event. They located the teenager who had given him a ride. They documented the purchase at the hamburger stand. They created a timeline showing that McCoy, if he had landed near Provo, could have traveled the necessary distances on foot or through hitchhiking to reach those locations by the times recorded in witness statements. Armed with this evidence, federal agents prepared to move quickly. On April 9, just 2 days after the hijacking, a federal complaint was filed. A warrant was issued for McCoy's arrest. Agents prepared to approach his home, aware that he was a trained military veteran familiar with weapons and survival tactics. They needed to take him into custody without risking escalation or confrontation. Surveillance teams positioned themselves around the property, tracking movements in and out. Once McCoy appeared within reach, agents moved in with deliberate coordination. McCoy was arrested at his Provo home. His reaction was controlled, neither overtly defensive nor panicked, but his demeanor offered no insight into guilt or innocence. Agents secured him and immediately served the search warrant on the property. The search revealed a collection of items that aligned tightly with the hijacking. In the residence, agents found large amounts of skydiving equipment, including gear consistent with the type used during the jump. They located an electric typewriter, whose key strike patterns matched the impressions on the typed hijack instructions. They uncovered $499,970 in cash, nearly the entire ransom, still bound in the original bands. The discovery of the money was decisive. Its presence signaled not only connection but possession. The combined weight of the handwriting comparison, fingerprint match, equipment inventory, witness sightings, and recovered ransom provided the FBI with one of the most rapid and complete cases in the history of American hijacking investigations. While agents transported McCoy for processing, forensic teams continued documenting evidence from the home. They photographed the recovered items, cataloged each component, and secured every piece of cash for federal banking verification. The alignment of evidence formed a clean, uninterrupted chain from the aircraft to the landing zone to McCoy's residence. Nothing in the sequence displayed inconsistencies. The hijacker's attempt to obscure identity through wigs or altered appearance held no power against the volume of physical evidence tying him to the crime. Within 48 hours of the jump, the investigation had moved from uncertainty to full identification, supported by forensic proof and confirmed through direct recovery of the ransom. The man who believed he had executed an untraceable plan had underestimated the speed at which evidence, witness accounts, and investigative coordination could dismantle his strategy. The ground search across Utah began as a race against an unknown adversary in the night. By its conclusion, the adversary had a name, an address, and a definitive link to one of the most elaborate hijack operations of the early 1970s. The escalation of the investigation following Richard Floyd McCoy Jr.'s arrest marked a transformation in the case, from fast-moving fieldwork into a structured legal and evidentiary process. In less than 3 days, the Federal Bureau of Investigation had identified the suspect, located a critical piece of parachute equipment, traced eyewitness accounts, matched fingerprints and handwriting, and uncovered nearly the entire ransom hidden inside his residence. With McCoy taken into custody, the case shifted into its next phase, constructing a prosecutable chain of evidence, preparing formal charges, and documenting each investigative step with the precision required for federal court. After his arrest, McCoy was transported to the nearest secure federal facility, where agents undertook the initial intake procedures. He carried himself with the composed bearing of a military veteran, revealing neither panic nor resignation. His physical posture remained steady, but his injuries, consistent with a hard parachute landing, were visible. Medical staff conducted examinations as required, documenting bruising, stiffness, and joint strain. These details aligned with the timeline investigators had constructed and reinforced the physical realities of a nighttime jump from a Boeing 727 at high altitude. Agents began assembling the formal case file. Every piece of evidence found in McCoy's home was photographed, tagged, and cataloged. The search team's documentation revealed a detailed inventory: skydiving helmets, harnesses, ripcord mechanisms, reserve parachutes, and other equipment associated with airborne operations. The presence of the typewriter stood out among the items seized. Laboratory technicians quickly compared typed samples from the machine with the hijacker's typed instructions recovered from the flight. The alignment between key strikes, spacing irregularities, and mechanical impressions demonstrated clear correspondence. This connection provided a second forensic link between McCoy and the hijacking. The recovery of $499,970 in cash formed the core of the prosecution's evidence. Agents counted and verified each bill, ensuring the total matched the expected ransom amount, with only minor discrepancies attributable to handling or potential loss during the jump. The money bands, serial numbers, and bank markings confirmed that the cash originated from the banks used by United Airlines to assemble the ransom in San Francisco. Investigators photographed the currency in organized stacks, establishing a visual and documented trail that tied the recovered money directly to the crime. The handwritten note found aboard the aircraft underwent further examination. Handwriting experts within the Federal Bureau of Investigation Laboratory expanded on their initial comparison by conducting a full analysis using McCoy's service documents, training records, and personal materials. They focused on stroke patterns, slant angles, spacing consistency, letter formation, and overall writing rhythm. The match was conclusive. Their report stated that the author of the hijacking note and McCoy were the same individual. This piece of evidence provided the prosecution with an important behavioral and mechanical link, proof that the writing style, manual motion, and personal tendencies aligned with McCoy's known samples. Fingerprint analysts continued examining items recovered from the aircraft. The latent print on the mainliner magazine had already been matched to McCoy's military file, but examiners broadened the search to determine whether any other fingerprints on cabin materials corresponded with his. Though not all prints were identifiable, the presence of even one confirmed fingerprint on a personal item left by the hijacker provided a direct physical bridge between McCoy and the crime scene. With these forensic elements forming a stable foundation, investigators moved to refine the narrative of McCoy's movements. They expanded the canvassing effort across Provo and surrounding regions, documenting accounts from individuals who had interacted with him during the night of April 7. The hamburger stand employee who had served him a milkshake provided a valuable timestamp. His recollection that McCoy moved stiffly supported the hypothesis that the hijacker had sustained injuries during landing. The teenager who had given McCoy a ride offered details about his clothing, posture, and the location where he was dropped off. These details helped investigators verify the consistency of McCoy's explanation of his whereabouts, an explanation that, once examined, carried inconsistencies that conflicted with the physical evidence. Within 48 hours of the hijacking, the Federal Bureau of Investigation's case had moved from probabilistic identification to established linkage. The prosecution team, led by federal attorneys with experience in hijacking cases, began organizing the structure of the charges. McCoy was indicted by a federal grand jury on April 14, an exceptionally rapid turnaround driven by the strength of the evidence. The charges included aircraft piracy and interference with a flight crew, both of which carried severe penalties. Prosecutors also prepared additional supporting charges in anticipation of potential legal strategy shifts. As preparations for trial advanced, investigators continued analyzing McCoy's background. His military record revealed deployment in Vietnam as a helicopter pilot and flight officer. His skydiving certifications documented consistent freefall experience, including high altitude and low visibility jumps. His academic work in police science at Brigham Young University suggested familiarity with law enforcement procedures, investigative strategies, and the structure of criminal prosecutions. These factors, combined with the sophistication of the hijacking plan, indicated that McCoy's operation was not an impulsive act, but a structured, deliberate effort, built on training and experience. Investigators also assessed the parallels between McCoy's actions and the D.B. Cooper hijacking of November 24, 1971. The similarities were unmistakable. A Boeing 727, an aft staircase escape, a nighttime parachute jump, a ransom demand, and the careful staging of events. But unlike the unresolved mystery surrounding Cooper, the McCoy case contained physical evidence that tied a named suspect to the crime. Agents noted that McCoy had studied news coverage of the Cooper case and had made comments to acquaintances, suggesting interest in the details. These observations did not directly factor into the indictment, but informed the investigative context. As the trial date approached, federal prosecutors assembled a chronological presentation of the hijacking, beginning with McCoy's boarding in Denver and concluding with his arrest in Provo. They prepared to introduce forensic evidence, witness testimony, aircraft crew accounts, and expert analysis. The Federal Bureau of Investigation Laboratory reports, written with technical clarity, would form the backbone of the prosecution's argument. Each component illustrated not only presence, but intent, planning, and execution. During pre-trial proceedings, McCoy maintained a firm position, denying involvement. He offered explanations for his injuries, his whereabouts on the night of the hijacking, and the presence of skydiving equipment in his home. These explanations, however, did not align with the recovered evidence. When investigators re-examined his statements and compared them to the objective record, contradictions appeared. His inability to account for the cash provided the most significant inconsistency. The presence of nearly the entire ransom in his home rendered alternative explanations untenable. The trial took place 2 months after the hijacking, reflecting an expedited legal process supported by the clarity of evidence. The courtroom environment remained tense but controlled. The prosecution presented a linear reconstruction of events supported by aircraft crew testimony, forensic analysis, and investigative findings. The flight attendants who had interacted with the hijacker described his behavior, clothing, and posture during the sequence of events. Their observations matched the physical characteristics noted by investigators. The pilots provided testimony about the demands, the altitude and speed requirements, and the exact moment when the hijacker lowered the rear stairs. Forensic experts from the FBI laboratory presented the handwriting and fingerprint analysis, outlining the methodologies used and the statistical certainties associated with each match. They explained the unique features of McCoy's typewriter and how those features corresponded to the hijacker's typed instructions. These details reinforced the prosecution's framing of the crime as an operation executed by an individual possessing advanced planning capabilities and technical familiarity with aircraft and skydiving procedures. The defense attempted to challenge components of the prosecution's evidence. They questioned the reliability of witness identifications, the interpretation of handwritten samples, and the chain of custody for certain pieces of physical evidence. They proposed alternative explanations for the money found in McCoy's home, though none carried plausibility in light of the overwhelming forensic matches. The defense strategy remained constrained by the volume of interlocking evidence, and every attempt to introduce uncertainty was countered by clear, documented facts. The jury observed a case presented with unusual clarity and linearity. Unlike many criminal investigations, in which evidence must be pieced together through circumstantial inference, the McCoy case contained direct physical linkage across multiple forensic domains. The timeline matched the geography, the fingerprints matched the object, the handwriting matched the note, the typewriter matched the instructions, the money matched the ransom. These overlapping layers reduced ambiguity to near zero. After reviewing the evidence, the jury returned a verdict, convicting McCoy on charges of aircraft piracy and interference with a flight crew. The federal court sentenced him to 45 years in prison. The sentencing reflected the severity of the crime, the premeditation involved, and the risks imposed on passengers, crew, and the broader aviation community. McCoy later appealed the conviction, but the United States Supreme Court declined to review the case on October 9, 1973, leaving the original ruling intact. His time in prison would later include escape attempts and additional legal events. But within the scope of the hijacking case, the legal outcome stood firmly anchored by the strength of the evidence assembled in the immediate aftermath of the crime. The investigation that began with a jump into the Utah night had concluded with a rapid, comprehensive prosecution built upon forensic certainty. The case entered the public record as one of the most efficiently solved hijackings of the era, while the legend of D.B. Cooper continued to persist in American culture as an unsolved aviation mystery. The McCoy case demonstrated that a similar operation, executed with comparable precision and daring, could be dismantled almost entirely within days through coordinated investigative effort, forensic analysis, and the rapid mobilization of federal resources. The jump, intended to offer anonymity, had instead left a trail of evidence clear enough to identify the culprit before he could vanish into the shadows he believed would protect him. The aftermath of Richard Floyd McCoy Jr.'s conviction did not signal the end of investigative activity. Instead, it shifted the federal focus toward understanding how a hijacking so intricate in planning could be executed by an individual without substantial assistance. The FBI and federal prosecutors needed to ensure that every link in the chain had been examined, every piece of evidence properly interpreted, and every possible accomplice ruled out before the case settled into historical record. Even with the clarity of the evidence, the unusual sophistication of the operation demanded deeper scrutiny. The investigation transitioned from identifying the perpetrator to reconstructing the structural environment in which the crime occurred. Federal agents began by re-evaluating McCoy's personal network. They examined his military history, academic environment, family relations, and social interactions. His service as a helicopter pilot provided him with advanced knowledge of aircraft behavior, but investigators needed to rule out whether anyone within his military circles had participated in planning the jump or helping him acquire materials. They interviewed individuals who had served with him, instructors who had trained him, and colleagues who had flown alongside him. The responses across these interviews formed a consistent pattern. McCoy had demonstrated skill as a pilot, but none reported involvement in or knowledge of any hijacking plan. His military record contained no behavior indicating a pattern of criminal collusion. Attention turned next to his academic surroundings at Brigham Young University. McCoy had been a police science major, attending classes focused on criminal procedures, evidence handling, investigative methodology, and legal structures. His coursework suggested that he studied the mechanisms of law enforcement with unusual interest, particularly the vulnerabilities within systems of response. Investigators reviewed his academic performance, classroom interactions, and assignments. Professors and classmates provided accounts of his disciplined engagement with the material, but none conveyed any indication that he had shared or hinted at plans related to a hijacking. The investigative team concluded that his academic studies had provided him with theoretical insights that likely informed his planning, but these insights had been acquired independently, rather than in collaboration with others. The FBI widened the scope by examining McCoy's financial circumstances. Long before the hijacking, he had faced mounting personal pressures related to finances. Investigators reviewed bank statements, loan records, and personal expenses to determine whether financial strain had been a driving factor. The evidence supported the conclusion that McCoy had been under persistent financial stress, but nothing in his records pointed toward any external force pushing him toward crime. These findings strengthened the theory that the hijacking had been motivated by financial desperation combined with personal ambition rather than by group coordination. Parallel to these inquiries, agents focused on reconstructing the full timeline of McCoy's movements on the day of the hijacking. They tracked his presence in Denver, his boarding of the aircraft, and his behavior leading up to the takeover. They scrutinized airport footage, passenger records, and staffing reports. Despite the limited security infrastructure of the early 1970s, the available documentation aligned closely. McCoy had moved alone, boarded alone, and carried himself through the airport without notable interaction. Investigators reinforced the conclusion that the operation had been executed independently. The investigation then expanded outward to examine how he acquired specific materials. Agents inspected receipts, store logs, and financial transactions linked to typewriter cartridges, jumpsuit fabric, skydiving straps, and other equipment. Local businesses were contacted to determine whether McCoy had purchased materials in a manner that suggested assistance or collaboration. Yet no transaction revealed unusual patterns. He had made several purchases independently over time, none of which appeared suspicious when viewed separately. Only in retrospect did the acquisition timeline form a coherent picture pointing toward preparation. In addition to material purchases, investigators examined whether McCoy had conducted reconnaissance flights or ground surveys prior to the hijacking. They looked for evidence that he had scouted terrain across Utah County, evaluated wind patterns, or calculated potential landing zones. The geographic familiarity he demonstrated during the planning phase indicated that he knew the region's topography intimately. However, this did not require reconnaissance activity. His years living in the area, combined with his aviation background, provided sufficient knowledge to select a suitable landing corridor. Agents confirmed that no unusual flight reservations, rental car records, or local maps tied him to deliberate reconnaissance. His understanding of the terrain appeared to originate from cumulative experience, rather than coordinated planning. The FBI next analyzed the hijacker's instructions in the typed envelope. The demands contained terminology consistent with aviation manuals and skydiving guides, suggesting that McCoy adapted existing technical knowledge rather than relying on outside assistance. The detailed instructions for runway selection, ground personnel restrictions, cabin behavior, and airspeed requirements were consistent with someone who had studied the Boeing 727's design. Agents consulted aviation experts to verify whether the document demonstrated insight beyond what a skilled pilot or trained skydiver could possess independently. The conclusion was clear. The instructions did not require specialized insider knowledge. They reflected a well-read, technically proficient flyer, not a coordinated team. The broader investigation then turned toward potential accomplices after the jump. Given the complexity of the escape, it was reasonable to examine whether anyone had assisted McCoy on the ground. Agents interviewed individuals living in rural Utah communities, focusing on areas near the landing site. They sought information about unusual nighttime activity on April 7th. Strangers on roads, vehicles moving without lights, or individuals seen carrying bulky items. Despite exhaustive canvassing, no credible evidence emerged, indicating that someone had been waiting or assisting him. The teenage witness, who had given him a ride, appeared to be a chance encounter. The hamburger stand employee had interacted with him under everyday circumstances. Nothing in the account suggested prearranged support. As agents continued refining the case, they considered whether McCoy had acted with knowledge gained from the D.B. Cooper hijacking. The similarities between the two crimes made this connection nearly unavoidable. Both involved the use of parachutes, hijacking a Boeing 727, demanding ransom, and escaping through the rear stairway. Investigators reviewed McCoy's library habits, magazine subscriptions, and reading interests. They examined newspaper clippings found in his home to determine whether he had studied the Cooper case. While his interest in the Cooper hijacking was noted, it did not support the idea of collaboration or direct influence from any party connected to that case. Instead, investigators concluded that McCoy had modeled his approach on the known details of the earlier hijacking, but adapted it using his own aviation and skydiving expertise. As investigators assessed the structural elements of the case, they needed to address one more critical question: whether McCoy could have survived the jump if he had chosen a landing zone under different conditions. The landing area near Provo presented relatively favorable terrain, open fields, manageable elevation, and proximity to roads. but other segments of the Utah corridor contained unforgiving topography that could have resulted in severe injury or death. Agents consulted parachuting experts to determine whether McCoy's descent matched the capabilities of a skilled skydiver. The experts responded that the altitude, speed, and weather conditions on the night of April 7th were survivable for someone with McCoy's experience. His ability to walk into a hamburger stand and interact with civilians shortly after landing supported the conclusion that he had executed the jump within the limits of trained capability. As the investigation matured, it became clear that the rapid sequence of forensic breakthroughs, fingerprints, handwriting, equipment, ransom recovery, left little ambiguity about McCoy's responsibility. But investigators also needed to document what the case did not show. There was no evidence of a second person on the aircraft, no indication of a collaborator on the ground, no financial transactions linking him to distributed planning, no behavioral patterns indicating an organized group effort. The structure of the crime began to resemble something precise yet solitary. A plan conceived and executed by one individual, drawing on a unique combination of skill sets. The prosecution team reviewed each investigative finding, focusing on ensuring that every point of convergence was supported by physical evidence or credible testimony. They documented the chain of custody for all materials, maintained clear forensic logs, and preserved digital and photographic records. The clarity of the investigation began to solidify into historical certainty. Although McCoy maintained his innocence throughout the legal process, the investigation had produced a complete and aligned narrative. The hijacking, the demands, the jump, the landing, the movements through Provo, and the ultimate recovery of the ransom, all of it connected by physical evidence, witness accounts, and forensic proof. The absence of loose ends reinforced the conclusion reached by agents and prosecutors. The case stood as one of the most thoroughly resolved hijacking investigations of its era. By the time the investigation formally closed, the FBI had constructed a rare example of an aviation crime, solved not through speculation or partial clues, but through a fully documented chain leading from planning to execution to arrest. The next phase for the federal system would be carrying out the sentence, while McCoy entered the correctional environment, where another sequence of events, unrelated to the hijacking, would eventually unfold. Meanwhile, FBI agents continued refining the detailed record of the McCoy investigation. The agency recognized the importance of producing a case file that could withstand scrutiny for decades. Each element needed to be preserved, not only for legal reasons, but also because comparisons to the Cooper case were already emerging in public conversation. McCoy's operation bore unmistakable similarities to the 1971 hijacking, leading some members of the public to speculate that the two cases were linked. The FBI, however, approached the issue through forensic evidence rather than cultural speculation. Investigators compared the ransom bills recovered from McCoy's residence with the serial numbers of the money given to Cooper. No overlap existed. They compared handwriting samples from McCoy to the letters associated with Cooper. There was no match. They compared physical descriptions, body measurements, and age profiles. Again, there was no alignment. While McCoy may have used the Cooper case as a conceptual template, the FBI concluded that the two hijackings were independent events carried out by different individuals with different motivations. This conclusion became part of the permanent investigative record. As the case solidified, analysts began evaluating whether McCoy's background provided insights that could be used to prevent similar crimes. His military experience highlighted a potential vulnerability. Individuals with training in aircraft mechanics, parachuting, and navigation possessed the skill set necessary to exploit aviation gaps. Federal agencies initiated early discussions on whether increased monitoring of high-risk skill combinations might assist in preemptive security assessment, but such proposals faced practical limitations. There were thousands of veterans with similar training, and the idea of predictive surveillance based on skill combinations alone carried inherent flaws. Ultimately, the Federal Aviation Administration determined that structural security improvements rather than personal profiling would provide the most effective long-term prevention. On the correctional side of the case, McCoy was processed into the federal prison system. His record, combined with the length of his sentence, placed him in a facility designed to house inmates considered moderate to high risk. The Bureau of Prisons documented his background, including military training, aviation experience, and skydiving proficiency. These skills flagged him as an escape risk, though the Bureau's internal classification system at the time lacked the advanced risk assessment models that would later be developed. McCoy entered prison with a quiet demeanor, offering no immediate indication of disruptive behavior, but authorities could not dismiss the possibility that his technical abilities might lead to escape attempts. As the months passed, McCoy maintained a controlled and disciplined routine inside the institution. He followed prison procedures without drawing attention. His record showed no significant incidents, disciplinary violations, or conflicts with other inmates. However, investigators analyzing the hijacking case understood that his behavior during the crime had also been controlled and deliberate. His calm demeanor in prison was therefore not interpreted as compliance, but as a continuation of the personality profile observed during the investigation: calculated, precise, and capable of long-term planning. Federal authorities revisited the chain of evidence periodically during this period, ensuring that no overlooked details could undermine the integrity of the case. Each time the evidence was reviewed, the same conclusions emerged. The fingerprint match, verified multiple times, stood as irrefutable proof of McCoy's physical presence in the aircraft beyond that of a normal passenger. The handwriting analysis, supported by a variety of independent samples, confirmed authorship of the hijack note. The typewriter match reinforced the presence of premeditation. The ransom recovery in his home provided the most definitive link possible between McCoy and the crime. No scenario existed in which such a combination of evidence could reasonably point to anyone else. Investigators also conducted follow-ups on the individuals who had provided tips or information. The person who had informed the FBI that McCoy once described a foolproof hijack plan was interviewed multiple times. Agents verified the consistency of the account, establishing that the individual had no reason to fabricate the story. Additional interviews with neighbors, associates, and acquaintances confirmed that McCoy had discussed aviation, parachuting, and hypothetical crime scenarios on prior occasions. These statements did not serve as primary evidence, but supported the contextual framework of premeditation. In an effort to refine aviation security policy, federal agencies used the McCoy case, along with the Cooper case and others from the era, to develop new requirements for passenger screening. The FAA collaborated with airlines, airport authorities, and the Department of Transportation to design a national protocol that would prevent weapons from being carried onto aircraft. These efforts would eventually lead to the introduction of physical screening, X-ray equipment, metal detectors, and systematic passenger checks across America's airports. The McCoy case influenced several aspects of these reforms, demonstrating the need for detection of concealed weapons and the vulnerability of flight crews in situations where a hijacker possessed strong aviation knowledge. As months passed, prison administrators continued to monitor McCoy. His days inside the institution unfolded with predictable routine, but internally, he began to concentrate on the possibility of escape. While not immediately visible to staff or fellow inmates, McCoy's military training and familiarity with tactical planning provided him with the ability to analyze physical layouts, daily schedules, and structural patterns within the prison environment. Reports later indicated that McCoy had begun studying the system around him, identifying areas where timing gaps or procedural weaknesses could be exploited. This shift in focus emerged gradually in investigative reviews conducted after later events. But during the initial months of his incarceration, authorities perceived no immediate warning signs. They recorded his behavior as compliant and orderly, unaware that the hijacker, who had executed an airborne escape, had begun conceptualizing a terrestrial one. Meanwhile, the public remained aware of the case through newspaper coverage. Journalists contrasted the resolution of the McCoy case with the lingering mystery surrounding D.B. Cooper. Comparisons circulated in editorials, opinion columns, and aviation features. Some speculated that McCoy might have been Cooper, using the earlier hijacking to refine his technique. But federal authorities dismissed the theory through repeated clarifications tied to forensic evidence. The public fascination persisted, however, even as investigators finalized the official record. The FBI concluded its internal review of the case by affirming that the investigation had uncovered no evidence of accomplices or external involvement. They established that McCoy had acted alone, driven by financial motives, and supported by a unique combination of military and aviation expertise. The precision of the crime did not require a support network. It required time, planning, and knowledge, factors McCoy possessed independently. By the time the investigation formally closed, federal authorities had not only secured the conviction of the hijacker, but also initiated systemic changes to prevent similar crimes. The case served as both a demonstration of the vulnerabilities of early 1970s aviation and as a catalyst for structural reform. McCoy entered the federal prison system, carrying the weight of a 45-year sentence. But the conclusion of the hijacking investigation did not mark the end of the narrative. Behind prison walls, another sequence, unrelated to the aircraft and parachutes, but equally rooted in McCoy's disciplined approach to planning, began to form, setting the stage for the next major development in his life. The transition from investigation and conviction into the period of incarceration marked a shift not only in Richard Floyd McCoy Jr.'s circumstances, but also in the nature of federal attention directed toward him. Once the court had delivered its judgment and the appeals process began, McCoy entered the structured routines of federal imprisonment. But the attributes that defined him during the hijacking, the precision, the discipline, the ability to observe systems and identify vulnerabilities, did not dissipate within the confines of a cell. Instead, they became the foundation of a new sequence of events that federal officials would later investigate, with the same rigor applied to the hijacking case itself. McCoy was transferred to the federal penitentiary in the Western District of Utah to begin serving his 45-year sentence. Upon entry, he underwent the standard intake procedures: medical evaluation, personal property processing, classification assessment, and orientation to institutional rules. His military posture and controlled tone led correctional staff to conclude that he would likely adapt to structured routines without immediate disruption. But his record as a helicopter pilot, an experienced parachutist, placed him in a risk category that warranted continued observation. The Bureau of Prisons noted his technical background, but the institutional assessment systems of the early 1970s lacked the layers of psychological and behavioral screening that would later become standard. During his first months in custody, McCoy maintained a steady routine. He completed assigned chores, adhered to institutional schedules, and interacted minimally with staff. His outward compliance created the impression of adjustment, but his internal calculations continued. Prison records documented no disciplinary issues. He occupied his time with reading, exercise, and the predictable cycle of prison life. But beneath the surface, he observed the rhythms of the facility: shift changes, security rotations, hallway traffic patterns, the movement of inmates during mealtimes, and the approaches used by guards during routine checks. Each detail, seemingly ordinary to others, provided him with operational insight. The origins of McCoy's escape plan did not reveal themselves immediately to prison authorities, but reconstructive investigations conducted later showed that he had begun the conceptual groundwork soon after arriving. His military training had instilled in him an understanding of timing, logistics, and structural vulnerabilities in controlled environments. The hijacking demonstrated his ability to identify and exploit a system's weakest points. Inside prison, he applied the same methodical thought process. The federal penitentiary where McCoy was housed included a mix of inmates with varied backgrounds. Among them were individuals already predisposed to escape attempts, as well as those serving shorter sentences who played no role in disruptive activity. McCoy gradually identified a small subset of inmates whose skills, dispositions, and desperation levels aligned with the requirements of an escape operation. Through these observations, he aligned himself with two inmates who would later participate in the escape: Larry R. Bagley and another prisoner with operational knowledge of metalwork. Their backgrounds differed considerably from McCoy's, but each man possessed a level of physical capability and willingness that would eventually make collaboration possible. The escape plan took shape in a structured manner. Federal investigators later determined that McCoy approached the operation with the same layered planning that characterized the hijacking. He identified tools, timing windows, structural weak points, and the roles required of each participant. The penitentiary contained a section under construction, an area where repairs and modifications created uneven security monitoring and temporary access to materials not normally available to inmates. The presence of scaffolding, loose metal, construction debris, and temporary barriers provided McCoy with an opportunity not ordinarily afforded within the federal prison system. He evaluated this area meticulously. He observed guard movements around it and tracked the periods when officer attention was diverted elsewhere. Over time, he became aware that the construction zone offered a physical gap that could be exploited if coordinated with precise timing. For the escape to succeed, he needed tools to cut through certain parts of the exterior structure. These tools were not officially available to inmates, but McCoy and his associates found ways to acquire improvised cutting devices by obtaining and repurposing small metal pieces from the construction debris. Investigative reports later confirmed that fragments of hacksaw blades had been smuggled into the area and used to weaken a portion of the perimeter. The time frame for the escape centered on August 10, 1974. On that day, McCoy and his accomplices initiated the plan during a period of reduced oversight. They used the concealed cutting tools to open a gap in one of the facility's windows. The process had been started earlier, with incremental weakening of the metal, to avoid drawing attention. On the day of the escape, they completed the final cuts quickly. The inmates moved through the gap, climbing into a partially restricted area used for construction storage. From there, they reached the outer perimeter of the facility and fled into the surrounding landscape. The escape triggered immediate response from prison staff. Officers initiated lockdown protocols, counted inmates, and confirmed the identities of those missing. Notifications were sent to the FBI, U.S. Marshals Service, and local law enforcement agencies across Utah and neighboring states. The scale of the response reflected McCoy's criminal history and the perceived danger associated with an escaped hijacker. Federal agents understood that McCoy possessed the ability to evade detection by accessing aircraft, utilizing his skydiving and piloting skills, or relying on military survival training. As a result, a multi-state manhunt began within hours. McCoy and his accomplices fled the facility and moved through the surrounding terrain. The escapees initially remained clustered, before separating to increase their chances of avoiding immediate capture. Investigators later concluded that McCoy relied on his understanding of the region and on skills developed during military survival training to navigate the landscape. He employed techniques designed to reduce traceability, including avoiding main roads, crossing natural barriers at non-obvious points, and moving during periods of low visibility. Federal agents analyzed potential escape routes and identified locations where McCoy might attempt to secure transportation. They anticipated that he might seek out rural airstrips or attempt to procure a vehicle by theft or manipulation. Agents stationed themselves at key points across Utah, Colorado, Nevada, and Wyoming. Simultaneously, they circulated McCoy's photograph to local law enforcement agencies, trucking companies, service stations, and border checkpoints. The distribution of information occurred rapidly, leveraging both federal networks and state enforcement channels. As the manhunt progressed, agents began receiving reports of sightings. These sightings varied in credibility. Some came from individuals who had read newspaper articles and believed they recognized McCoy in strangers. Others came from drivers who had picked up hitchhikers, matching vague descriptions. Investigators filtered out the unreliable reports, focusing instead on sightings consistent with physical details and geographic plausibility. The turning point in the manhunt occurred when federal agents traced McCoy's movement into the eastern United States. Reports from Tennessee, Virginia, and Pennsylvania indicated the presence of an individual resembling McCoy. These sightings aligned with a pattern of transportation that suggested he had managed to secure vehicular movement, possibly through stolen vehicles or assistance from sympathetic acquaintances. While investigators found no evidence of an accomplice actively involved in the escape, they considered the possibility that McCoy had tapped into personal networks not fully mapped during the initial investigation. The decisive moment arrived on April 9, 1974, when FBI agents located McCoy in Virginia Beach, Virginia. He had taken refuge in a residence believed to belong to a distant acquaintance. Surveillance confirmed his presence inside. Federal agents surrounded the home, approaching with caution due to the risk associated with McCoy's military background and the possibility that he might be armed. Agents moved into position and began the entry sequence. McCoy reacted to their arrival by attempting to flee internally, moving through the house and taking up defensive positioning. Agents advanced through the structure, maintaining coordinated movement to prevent escape. The confrontation concluded when an agent discharged a weapon, resulting in McCoy being fatally wounded during the operation. Medical personnel were brought in immediately, but McCoy did not survive. Following his death, federal agents secured the residence and began the investigative process associated with officer-involved shootings. They documented the interior of the home, photographed McCoy's position, and conducted interviews with all agents present. They found no evidence suggesting that McCoy had planned an additional escape attempt or organized a secondary crime. The items discovered in the home were consistent with improvised living arrangements. During flight, the Bureau of Prisons conducted a parallel review to determine how McCoy had managed to escape from the facility. The investigation identified procedural gaps in construction zone security, inadequate monitoring of inmate movement near restricted areas, and insufficient detection of improvised tools. The findings prompted internal policy updates, including increased surveillance in construction areas, stricter tool control protocols, and enhanced monitoring of inmates with military training or escape risk classifications. In the larger context of federal aviation security, McCoy's escape and subsequent death closed the final chapter of the hijacking case. His life had traced a trajectory defined by skill, precision, and calculated risk-taking, but ultimately bound by the constraints of evidence and consequence. The hijacking investigation had demonstrated his ability to exploit structural vulnerabilities. The escape had demonstrated the continued danger posed by those skills. But the manhunt concluded with a definitive end, removing the possibility of future attempts or renewed public threat. Following his death, federal agents secured the residence and began the investigative process associated with officer-involved shootings. They documented the interior of the home, photographed McCoy's position, and conducted interviews with all agents present. They found no evidence suggesting that McCoy had planned an additional escape attempt or organized a secondary crime. The items discovered in the home were consistent with improvised living arrangements. During flight, the Bureau of Prisons conducted a parallel review to determine how McCoy had managed to escape from the facility. The investigation identified procedural gaps in construction zone security, inadequate monitoring of inmate movement near restricted areas, and insufficient detection of improvised tools. The findings prompted internal policy updates, including increased surveillance in construction areas, stricter tool control protocols, and enhanced monitoring of inmates with military training or escape risk classifications. In the larger context of federal aviation security, McCoy's escape and subsequent death closed the final chapter of the hijacking case. His life had traced a trajectory defined by skill, precision, and calculated risk-taking, but ultimately bound by the constraints of evidence and consequence. The hijacking investigation had demonstrated his ability to exploit structural vulnerabilities. The escape had demonstrated the continued danger posed by those skills. But the manhunt concluded with a definitive end, removing the possibility of future attempts or renewed public threat. Federal authorities filed a final collection of reports, documenting the full arc of the case, from the moment McCoy boarded Flight 855 in Denver to the night of his death in Virginia Beach. These records formed the basis for future studies of aviation security, prison escape prevention, and the behavioral profiles of individuals capable of complex high-risk crimes. The McCoy case remained historically significant, not only because of the hijacking itself, but also because of its rapid resolution, forensic clarity, and the policy changes that resulted from it. His escape and subsequent death added a final, decisive layer to the narrative, sealing the case in federal record as one of the most thoroughly documented hijackings of the 20th century. Parallel to the FBI's internal review, the Bureau of Prisons initiated a detailed examination of the escape. The investigation focused on procedural lapses within the correctional environment, particularly concerning construction zone oversight. The report documented that McCoy and his accomplices exploited a section of the facility that lacked the full security reinforcement present in other areas. Temporary barriers, tool access irregularities, and incomplete perimeter checks created conditions suitable for manipulation. Inspectors concluded that prison personnel had underestimated the risk posed by McCoy, in part because his initial behavior suggested compliance. His military skills, technical training, and demonstrated capacity for strategic planning had not been factored adequately into his risk classification. The Bureau of Prisons used these findings to implement immediate changes. Construction areas within all federal institutions were reclassified as high-risk environments requiring increased supervision. Tool control policies were strengthened, introducing standardized tracking procedures for all cutting devices, metal fragments, and construction materials. Correctional officers received updated training in identifying signs of clandestine preparation for escape, including the improper accumulation of materials that could be used to defeat perimeter barriers. Additionally, inmates with military or aviation backgrounds began receiving enhanced risk assessments to determine whether their technical skills increased their escape potential. The U.S. Marshals Service, responsible for fugitive operations, constructed an extensive review of the manhunt. They documented the tracking sequence from Utah to Virginia, evaluated response times and interstate coordination, and assessed the tactical decisions taken during the confrontation. The marshals determined that the rapid dissemination of McCoy's photograph and background information had been critical to locating him within weeks of the escape. The manhunt incorporated coordinated field operation, surveillance of potential travel routes of force standards. The marshals concluded that their tactical response was justified by McCoy's escape history, prior violent actions, and potential threat to officer safety. The death of Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. during the federal manhunt did not close the administrative obligations associated with his case. Instead, it triggered a comprehensive post-incident review conducted across multiple agencies: the FBI, the Bureau of Prisons, the U.S. Marshals Service, and the Federal Aviation Administration. Each organization needed to finalize its internal documentation, assess procedural failures, and define the institutional lessons derived from both the hijacking and the escape. The formal examination of the case extended long beyond McCoy's death, resulting in a layered analysis that would influence federal policy in aviation security, prisoner classification, and operational coordination. The FBI began the most extensive review, assembling every investigative branch involved from the hijacking through the fugitive tracking. Agents reconstructed the sequences of events, beginning at Newark, continuing through Denver, San Francisco, the jump over Utah, the forensic breakthroughs, the arrest, the search of McCoy's home, the trial, the incarceration, the escape, and the final confrontation in Virginia Beach. The Bureau needed to ensure that each phase adhered to federal procedure, that each decision aligned with policy, and that the concluding actions taken during the manhunt were justified according to operational guidelines. Investigators examined all field reports, surveillance logs, laboratory findings, and interagency communications associated with the case. The review confirmed that the investigative phase leading to McCoy's arrest set a strong procedural example. The fingerprint match, handwriting results, ransom recovery, and witness accounts formed a nearly unprecedented evidentiary chain for a modern hijacking. The speed at which the FBI identified and apprehended the suspect was noted as among the fastest resolutions for a major aviation crime of the era. However, investigators acknowledged the necessity of strengthening aviation security measures to prevent future incidents with similar characteristics. The McCoy operation had revealed vulnerabilities that required structural and regulatory responses beyond law enforcement capability. The Federal Aviation Administration, having already initiated security reforms based on the hijacking, expanded its assessment. The agency concluded that McCoy's ability to board a commercial aircraft with concealed weapons stemmed from security protocols that did not include mandatory passenger screening. The FAA finalized national requirements for metal detectors, X-ray systems, and systematic baggage inspection. Additionally, the FAA worked with aircraft manufacturers to address vulnerabilities associated with the Boeing 727's aft stair system. The resulting Cooper vane mechanism, named after the earlier hijacker, but accelerated by the McCoy case, prevented the stairway from opening while the aircraft was in flight. These changes were added to the aircraft's design modifications and distributed across the airline industry. The FAA's final report stated that the hijacking by McCoy, when combined with prior incidents, demonstrated an urgent need for industry-wide structural reform. While federal agencies refined their internal records, the courts processed the administrative closure of McCoy's legal appeals. His death terminated all pending judicial motions associated with his conviction. The U.S. Supreme Court had already declined review of his earlier appeal, cementing the original ruling. After his death, the appellate system listed his case as closed, with the conviction standing as the final legal determination. Federal prosecutors archived their records, reflecting a case that had moved through the judiciary with clarity and without procedural irregularities. In the academic and criminological communities, the McCoy case quickly became a subject of analysis. Researchers studying hijacking behavior in the early 1970s used the case as an example of how specific skill combinations, military aviation training, parachuting experience, and knowledge of law enforcement procedures could create opportunities for complex criminal operations. The case demonstrated how individuals capable of functioning under stress, maintaining composure, and organizing sequential tasks could exploit systemic vulnerabilities. The speed of McCoy's arrest, however, revealed the limits of operational secrecy. His technical ability enabled the crime, but his forensic trail prevented continuation. Criminologists cited his case as a demonstration that crimes requiring technical expertise often leave extensive physical evidence, especially when executed alone. From a policy standpoint, the case influenced federal approaches to aviation crime. The Department of Transportation and the FAA continued to expand technological security measures, eventually leading to the security frameworks that characterized American airports in the late 20th century. McCoy's hijacking and the Cooper case were viewed collectively as catalysts for these reforms. The federal government used the documented vulnerabilities, highlighted by both hijackings, to justify large-scale implementation of screening technologies, behavioral monitoring, and structural aircraft modifications. These changes fundamentally altered the relationship between passengers and aviation security, shaping the framework still in place decades later. Public interest in the McCoy case intensified again in the wake of his death, largely due to ongoing comparisons to the unsolved D.B. Cooper hijacking. Media outlets revisited the similarities between the cases, examining whether McCoy might have been the earlier hijacker. The FBI addressed these claims directly through public statements, rooted in forensic evidence. They emphasized that the fingerprints found on McCoy's items did not match any fingerprints associated with Cooper-related evidence, that the ransom money recovered from McCoy's home did not match the serial numbers of Cooper's ransom, that physical descriptions, age profiles, and behavioral patterns differed significantly, and that McCoy had been definitively placed in other locations during the Cooper hijacking. These clarifications formed part of the FBI's long-term strategy to separate the two cases in public memory as the administrative and investigative work drew toward completion. Federal agencies prepared their final documentation. The FBI's closing report summarized the entire trajectory of the case with chronological clarity. The boarding of Flight 855 in Denver, the takeover using a handgun and grenade, the typed instructions demanding ransom, parachutes, and runway control, the release of passengers in San Francisco, the technical flight conditions ordered for the escape, the parachute jump over Utah, the discovery of the parachute pack by the teenager, the forensic examinations, the rapid identification of McCoy, the arrest, the recovery of the ransom, the conviction, the escape, the manhunt, and the final confrontation leading to his death. Each element was preserved in detail to maintain a complete historical record. The Bureau of Prisons compiled its own report, incorporating corrective actions and updated policies. The United States Marshal Service finalized its strategic review of fugitive operations, using the manhunt as a case study for tracking highly skilled fugitives with military training. The Federal Aviation Administration incorporated the lessons of the hijacking into its permanent security guidelines. Together, these organizations created an interlocking administrative archive that captured the full impact of the McCoy case on federal policy, When all institutional reports were complete, the final phase involved transferring the case materials to long-term archival storage. This ensured that future investigators, policymakers, and historians could access the complete record. The McCoy case extended beyond the narrative of a single crime. It became a reference point demonstrating how multiple federal agencies responded to a complex aviation threat with coordinated investigation, rapid adaptation, and systemic reform. In the years that followed, the case remained a staple of aviation security history. Researchers and analysts viewed it not simply as one man's crime, but as a structural event that revealed weaknesses in a national infrastructure undergoing rapid modernization. The response to the case reinforced federal capacity for forensic analysis and accelerated improvements in aviation screening. McCoy's hijacking, escape, and death formed a sequence of events that tested federal institutions across investigative, correctional, and operational domains. By the time the case was fully archived, the federal government had reached a comprehensive conclusion. The hijacking executed by Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. demonstrated the necessity of systematic change in aviation security, reinforced the importance of forensic evidence in rapid suspect identification, revealed weaknesses in prison escape prevention, and provided a clear example of how technical expertise can both enable criminal activity and contribute to its unraveling. His death closed the personal narrative, but the institutional consequences remained active within federal policy for decades. Act 10 marked the final phase of the operational history of the case. What remained was the broader historical reflection, an account of how the hijacking, the investigation, the escape, and the aftermath fit into the larger evolution of American aviation security. That reflection would form the foundation for the concluding chapter. The final archival consolidation of the Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. case established its place within the broader history of American aviation security and federal criminal investigation. Although his individual actions spanned only a brief period, from the hijacking in April 1972 to his escape and death in 1974, the structural consequences extended far beyond his lifetime. The federal systems that intersected with his case, including aviation authorities, investigative agencies, correctional institutions, and judicial bodies, each carried forward policies and procedural changes shaped in part by the operational lessons derived from the McCoy investigation. The public memory of the case took a path distinct from that of many high-profile crimes from the same era. McCoy's operation resembled the D.B. Cooper hijacking so closely that comparisons became inevitable. But the presence of forensic evidence, direct witness accounts, and the recovery of the ransom marked a sharp contrast between the two events. Where Cooper's identity remained unresolved and produced decades of speculation and cultural fascination, McCoy's identity was conclusively established within days of the crime. His case became a technical study, rather than a mystery. Investigators framed it as a demonstration of how meticulous planning can be executed by a single individual, but also how quickly such planning can unravel when evidence is left behind. With the close of federal investigative activity, researchers began using the case as a model for understanding hijacking behavior in the early 1970s. They noted the convergence of factors that enabled the crime: the absence of airport screening technologies, the design of the Boeing 727's aft stairway, the lack of standardized procedures for responding to ransom-based hijackings, and the insufficient coordination between agencies prior to the emergence of modern aviation security infrastructure. The McCoy case, in combination with prior and subsequent hijackings, helped crystallize the federal understanding that commercial aviation required a security framework capable of preventing weapons smuggling, regulating passenger movement, and mitigating controlled access to aircraft infrastructure. The Federal Aviation Administration used the case to support the rollout of national passenger screening standards. Metal detectors became mandatory across major airports. X-ray machines were introduced to inspect carry-on luggage. Airlines adopted protocols for monitoring suspicious behavior, though early behavioral assessment programs lacked the scientific structure they would later develop. The FAA also mandated modifications to the Boeing 727 fleet, installing the Cooper vane device that prevented the aft stairway from being lowered during flight. This modification effectively closed the structural vulnerability exploited by both Cooper and McCoy. Aircraft manufacturers began incorporating additional engineering safeguards into new models, focusing on preventing unauthorized access to exterior components while airborne. Federal law enforcement agencies used the McCoy case to refine investigative strategies. The FBI's rapid identification of the hijacker through fingerprints, handwriting analysis, and witness testimony demonstrated the effectiveness of multi-source forensic integration. The Bureau formalized procedures for rapid evidence consolidation following aviation crimes, ensuring that fingerprints, notes, typed documents, and passenger materials would be prioritized for laboratory analysis. The case also highlighted the value of civilian tips, such as the call from a Provo resident that directed investigators toward McCoy, based on prior conversations. As a result, the FBI expanded public reporting protocols for aviation-related incidents, encouraging citizens to come forward with relevant information during ongoing investigations. Within the Bureau of Prisons, reforms were implemented to address institutional vulnerabilities, were formally reclassified as zones requiring heightened supervision. Tool control policies were standardized across federal institutions, requiring detailed accounting for blades, saws, metal fragments, and equipment used by contractors. Inmates with technical backgrounds, including those trained in aviation, engineering, or military operations, began receiving enhanced monitoring in facilities where construction or renovation projects were underway. Classification protocols were updated to factor in technical proficiency and the capacity to exploit structural vulnerabilities. These improvements reflected an awareness that individuals capable of coordinating complex crimes may also possess the skills to plan highly structured escapes. The U.S. Marshals Service used the McCoy manhunt to refine fugitive tracking methodology. The pursuit demonstrated the necessity of interstate coordination, rapid information dissemination, and tactical adaptability. Reports generated after the case emphasized the importance of establishing confirmed sighting patterns, separating credible leads from public speculation, and deploying field units with precise instructions based on verified intelligence. The Marshals also documented the necessity of pre-planning containment strategies in multi-state manhunts, involving fugitives with military or technical training. These lessons influenced manhunt procedures throughout the remainder of the 1970s. As federal agencies incorporated the lessons of the case into their operating frameworks, the narrative of McCoy's hijacking and escape entered academic literature. Criminologists examined the psychological structure of individuals who attempt high-risk crimes involving advanced technical skill. They analyzed patterns of behavior associated with military veterans who transitioned into criminal activity. Though most veterans never engaged in such conduct, researchers viewed McCoy's case as a demonstration of how technical training, environmental familiarity, and perceived financial pressure can converge into a calculated decision to exploit systemic weaknesses. Yet the case also emphasized the limits of such planning. Forensic systems, investigative coordination, and witness cooperation can produce rapid identification even when a crime appears structurally complex. Historians of aviation security studied the case as part of a broader narrative, illustrating the transitional era between unregulated air travel and the highly secured environment that emerged in the decades afterward. Prior to the early 1970s, passengers boarded aircraft much like they boarded trains or buses. Airports were open spaces with minimal screening and few restrictions. The spate of hijackings that occurred between 1968 and 1973, including the McCoy case, marked a turning point. Aviation historians connected the structural reforms of the mid-1970s directly to the vulnerabilities exposed by these crimes. In this context, McCoy's hijacking served as one of the final catalysts compelling lawmakers to formalize security in a manner that transformed public expectations of air travel. Meanwhile, McCoy's personal narrative reached its conclusion with his death, but the administrative processes associated with his case continued. Federal agencies archived the materials, including flight manifests, aircraft photographs, forensic lab reports, and prison records. These archives were preserved to support future operational reviews, legal research, and public inquiries. Over time, researchers consulting the case found it notable for its completeness. Few hijacking investigations from the early 1970s retained such a clean evidentiary record or such definitive forensic linkage. The clarity of the chain of evidence made the McCoy case particularly valuable for historical study. Authorities also documented the ways in which the public engaged with the case. While not as culturally enduring as the Cooper mystery, McCoy's story reappeared periodically in media summaries, aviation retrospectives, and analyses of high-profile escapes. Journalists often contrasted the two cases, one unsolved and steeped in speculation, the other solved with forensic precision. One hijacker disappearing into the night without a trace, the other leaving behind fingerprints, handwritten notes, and nearly the entire ransom. These contrasts reinforced the federal conclusion that the two hijackings, though superficially similar, reflected different operational profiles and different outcomes. Within law enforcement training programs, instructors used the McCoy case to illustrate the risks of underestimating individuals with technical expertise. New agents studied the case during aviation countermeasures, seminars, and fugitive tracking courses. Correctional officers analyzed the escape to understand how materials in construction zones can be used to breach institutional boundaries. Aviation security trainees examined the mechanics of the Boeing 727's aft stairway and the procedural flaws in airport boarding systems of the era. Each group used the case to understand how coordinated federal action, when combined with forensic clarity, can dismantle a complex crime in days. As decades passed, the structural reforms triggered by the McCoy case became permanent components of aviation and federal security. Passengers entering airports encountered metal detectors, X-ray screening, and identification protocols that had no equivalent during McCoy's time. Aircraft incorporated security reinforcements designed to prevent access to external components during flight. Correctional institutions applied stricter classifications and security procedures. Fugitive operations employed coordinated multi-state manhunt systems. Each of these advancements reflected a direct or indirect legacy of the hijacking. From a historical perspective, the McCoy case occupied a unique position. It represented the intersection of an era when aviation was transitioning from openness to regulation, when federal forensic capabilities were advancing rapidly, and when the government was refining its response to increasingly complex criminal operations. The case served as a demonstration of how one individual's exploitation of systemic vulnerabilities could accelerate widespread structural change. Though McCoy himself did not survive long after his crime, the institutional responses shaped by his actions endured. By the time the case reached its full archival closure, the federal government had produced an exhaustive record that captured each phase with clarity. Investigators, legislators, administrators, and researchers could trace the entire sequence, from planning to consequence. The hijacking no longer existed merely as an incident. It existed as a structured narrative of vulnerability, action, and reform. The final record reflected a complete arc: a hijacking executed with technical proficiency, an investigation resolved through forensic determinism, a legal process carried out with precision, an escape revealing institutional vulnerabilities, a manhunt culminating in a definitive end, and a series of federal reforms that reshaped American aviation and correctional security. In the broader chronology of 20th century crime, the McCoy case stood as an example of how a single event, executed over several hours and resolved over several years, could generate systemic changes that outlasted every individual involved. It marked the conclusion of a narrative shaped not only by the actions of the hijacker, but by the responses of the institutions charged with preventing, investigating, and resolving such crimes. The final archival entry closed the operational history of the case, ensuring that its lessons remained accessible for the generations of federal personnel who would inherit the responsibility of protecting the nation's aviation and security systems.